When's the last time you've heard someone say something amazing? Well, today we're going to listen to the amazing words of Jesus from a place called Nazareth. Welcome once again to this teaching where we use the Bible and the map of Israel to sort of locate where stories took place that are mentioned in the Bible and actually look at sort of the behind-the-scenes details of these narratives themselves. And that's really what we're going to do today from God's Word. We're going to look at Luke chapter 4, a familiar story early on in the life and ministry of Jesus as he was standing in this synagogue and later on, no doubt, sitting and explaining the text of Isaiah. It's a great narrative with a lot of hidden details that I think really exposes the true primary purpose of Jesus coming. So we're going to go to Nazareth. Today it's a big city, really, but back in the days of Jesus, it was a very small city, but large enough at least to have a synagogue. And that's the story from Luke 4. So let's turn to our teaching today. And again, if you care to follow us and get up-to-date information about our future teachings, make sure that you hit the subscribe as well as the bell button there below this screen so that you can track us and share our ministry with others. So let's get started. Luke 4. Here we go. Our story today takes us back to Israel, but specifically to the city of Nazareth. Although in the days of Jesus, Nazareth was just a small town or village. So we go back to the land, and the land serves as our context, and the story that we will read from is Luke 4. Nazareth is north of the Jezreel Valley in the northern part of Israel. It's about 40 miles or so from Capernaum, so it's not a long distance at all. It's technically what begins the lower Galilee. In fact, flying into and over Nazareth, we'll see its proximity to the Jezreel Valley. So the Nazareth Ridge is right here. This is a picture of the Jezreel Valley. You can see Megiddo as illustrated here in this picture on the south end of the valley, the hill of Moreh, Mount Tabor, and here's the Nazareth Ridge coming into view. Once again, a different angle with Nazareth being over in this vicinity. But when we get closer to the city, a city, by the way, that is about 80 or 90,000 people today, we have Arab Israelis who are primarily the bulk of the population, although we do have some Israeli Jews as well who have a certain section of the city. But from Megiddo, this is the view of Nazareth and the ridge that we see on top there upon which the city is built, of course. But notice also that Nazareth is only about 4.5 miles from the main city in the days of Jesus. That would be Sepphoris or Sippori. Sepphoris actually revolted against the Romans when Jesus is about 10 years old. And Nazareth would have been not even on the radar screen because of the smallness of the city. In fact, it's not even mentioned by historical records. Josephus and I believe the Talmud don't even mention it as well. So when we try to fly into, or at least closer to Nazareth from the precipice of Nazareth, we can see the topography of this area. The precipice is only a traditional location for the Luke 4 passage, but here we can see a good part of Nazareth today. Once again, it's primarily an Arab-Israeli city. So when we talk about Nazareth now, we have a traditional location for the Annunciation to Mary by the angel. It's called the Church of Annunciation, a Catholic church, but just nearby this Catholic church are some first century ruins. There's not many, and they're not impressive. But perhaps did Jesus know of these structures, if they were indeed houses from his time period? That's a good question, but most likely yes. I like this depiction of maybe what Nazareth looked like. Only a small village, but it had to have at least enough families and certainly enough men, 10 in number, to have its own synagogue. So when we talk about synagogues, even though nothing of the synagogue in Nazareth has been located, let's at least turn to another synagogue that does date to the time of Jesus that has been discovered at a place called Magdala. Here you can see the simplicities of this structure. In fact, we can see it from this angle. People would have sat around benches, and my guess is that the synagogue at Nazareth that we're going to read about was similarly modest like this one. There's another synagogue that dates to the 1st century that's located at Gamla. This is a little larger, but still you can see the stone structures and the benches. And of course, you can picture Jesus maybe even teaching from inside. Now, this is a reconstructed one. And again, it depicts, I think, fairly accurately what a synagogue looked like. And of course, when we read our story from Luke 4, it's Jesus who is in the middle reading from the scroll of Isaiah. People would have been listening to him while sitting around on the benches. Synagogues, by the way, prior to 70 A.D. were not worship centers. They were more teaching and gathering locations. So this is a story from Luke 4, and then we'll make a couple observations as we read and unfold the story. Jesus returned to Galilee in the power of the Spirit, and news about him spread through the whole countryside. He taught in their synagogues, and everyone praised him. By the way, in Israel, about 7 synagogues have been discovered so far that date to the 1st century. He went to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and on the Sabbath day he went into the synagogue, as was his custom, and he stood up to read. The scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. Unrolling it, he found the place where it is written. And by the way, at this point, before we continue with what he quotes from, Isaiah chapter 61 primarily, know that a Sabbath synagogue service included the reading of the Torah or the law and the Ketuvim or the writings. These were sort of prescribed readings. However, the rabbi who was teaching that day had the prerogative to read any passage that he wanted to from the scroll that was handed to him. It was his prerogative to read from the Nevi'im, or the prophets. So Jesus found the place where it is written, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to release the oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." Then he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fastened on him, and he began by saying to them, "Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." All spoke well of him and were amazed at the gracious words that came from his lips. "Isn't this Joseph's son?" they asked. Jesus said to them, "Surely you will quote this proverb to me, 'Physician, heal yourself.' Do here in your hometown what we have heard that you did in Capernaum." "I tell you the truth," he continued, "no prophet is accepted in his hometown. I assure you that there were many widows in Israel in Elijah's time, when the sky was shut for 3.5 years, and there was a severe famine through the land. Yet Elijah was not sent to any of them, but to a widow in Zarephath, in the region of Sidon. And there were many in Israel with leprosy in the time of Elisha the prophet. Yet not one of them was cleansed, only Nahum the Syrian. All the people in the synagogue were furious when they heard this. They got up, drove him out of the town, and took him to the brow of the hill on which the town was built, in order to throw him off the cliff. But he walked right through the crowd and went on his way. Then he went down to Capernaum, a town in Galilee, and on the Sabbath began to teach the people. They were amazed at his teaching, because his message had authority. So when Jesus is teaching here in the synagogue at Nazareth, he's handed the scroll of Isaiah. This particular scroll is one of two that were found in Qumran, one of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And what I'm not saying is that it was this specific scroll that Jesus read from, but most likely a scroll like this. And the portion that he quotes is seen right here. So can you picture Jesus in a synagogue similar to this one at Magdala, perhaps even on this platform stone, maybe even sitting down on this, because when you sat, you showed authority. This particular stone was actually found at Magdala. You can see how the Jewish symbols are very clear to see, the menorah and the amphora as well. But when we read and compare what Jesus quoted from, specifically this portion of what we know as of Isaiah 61, notice what Jesus says specifically. The Lord has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. There it is. Jesus shares these words specifically. To bind up the brokenhearted. It appears as if Jesus did not quote from this phrase. To proclaim freedom for the captives. Seems like Jesus was very close in quoting, proclaim freedom for the prisoners. Release from the darkness, although the Qumran scrolls actually have implied, and specifically the words opening the eyes for the prisoners, and Jesus perhaps knew this. He mentions the recovery of the sight for the blind and the release for the oppressed. Jesus includes maybe something along the lines of proclaiming freedom for these oppressed captives. And then to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Well, Jesus also, in a similar fashion, quotes from that phrase, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn, to provide for those who grieve in Zion, to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of gladness instead of mourning, and the garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. They will be called oaks of righteousness, a planting of the Lord for the display of his splendor. Incidentally, this term opening of the eyes also is very common in the book of Isaiah. So what Jesus does is that he leaves out a few of the phrases, and yet he inserts one that perhaps comes from Isaiah 58. Now, this is a passage about fasting. Is not this the kind of fasting I've chosen, to loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke? Again, implying the unbinding of the captive, if you will. But here's this phrase, to set the oppressed free and to break every yoke. Now, Jesus has the prerogative to read whatever he wants to, but what's glaring in front of us is what is omitted. Specifically, the major phrase that Jesus leaves out from Isaiah 61 is the day of vengeance of our God. You see, his audience that day were expecting Jesus to proclaim and pronounce vengeance upon the enemies of God, most likely the Romans who held them in bondage. But certainly Jesus leaves out this reference and instead quotes and even mentions two Gentiles back in the days of Elijah and Elisha who were shown mercy by God. This is what aggravated the audience or the crowd that day in the synagogue, and they throw him out of the synagogue and they take him to the brow of the hill on top of which the city was built, and they attempt to throw him off. And yet Jesus displays in this early part of his ministry not only authority to read this passage and to imply that it was fulfilled in their hearing, but to show compassion in his kingdom to not only Jews but also to Gentiles alike. So Jesus here, early in his ministry, is displaying grace and salvation for all. It's a remarkable story of Jesus and the teaching of the scrolls and the redemption of God that would come only through him and his ministry. You know what strikes me the most about this teaching, where we have Jesus teaching and sharing really the scroll of Isaiah? Of course, it was his prerogative, as we shared, to read whatever passage of the prophets that he chose to read. Of course, he takes from chapter 61 and maybe a verse from chapter 58, as we saw. But what strikes me the most about this is not only him sharing his purpose of his coming, but at the end of that narrative, what is he doing? He's going to Capernaum and doing the same thing. He's teaching in the synagogue there as well. You see, this was not a setback at all, as people in Nazareth decided, at least some of them decided, nah, Jesus, you're not for us. You're not the Messiah. And yet Jesus remained resolved to teach about the kingdom, and he does the same thing in Capernaum along the shoreline of the Sea of Galilee. But his purpose is really why we exist. He came to save us from our sin. He came to offer us salvation. He came to open our spiritual eyes so that we can see our need for him. So let's open our hearts and our eyes to him today, and I'm hoping that you are receiving him as your Savior as well as living for him as we understand his teaching here from Luke 4. So again, thanks so much for joining us. Until next time, we hope that you join us again for some more teaching from the Bible. Shalom, shalom.